Number 1. Skylar Neese was 16, a bright honors student from Star City, West Virginia, who dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Her closest circle included Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, classmates who were often photographed laughing with her in hallways and posting friendly notes online. Outwardly, they were a typical trio navigating classes, part-time jobs, and the small dramas of high school. Inside that friendship, though, tensions simmered, jealousies, shifting alliances, and secrets none of the adults around them fully grasped. On a warm night in early July of 2012, Skylar quietly slipped out her bedroom window to meet the two girls she trusted most. She never came home. In the months that followed, Sheila and Rachel tweeted hopes that Skylar would be found and sat with her parents, offering comfort no one questioned at first. Investigators canvassed the apartment complex, pulled surveillance video, and traced a light-colored sedan seen outside Skylar's window after midnight. As the timeline hardened, the girls' stories shifted. Behind the social media concern was a plan born of resentment and the cold decision to remove a friend they no longer wanted around. When Rachel finally broke, she told authorities they acted because they didn't like her, a flat explanation that stunned even veteran detectives. Rachel's confession unlocked the case. She admitted that, after picking Skylar up near her home, she and Sheila drove across the state line to a rural area in Greene County, Pennsylvania. The meeting, presented as a late-night hangout, was a trap. Rachel agreed to lead investigators back to the remote spot months later, and federal testing confirmed the remains recovered in mid-January of 2013 were Skylar's. That scientific identification gave her parents the answer they dreaded and allowed the state to move forward with adult charges against both teenagers. The legal process moved briskly once the truth surfaced. Rachel pleaded guilty to second-degree murder after transferring to adult court, an acknowledgement of her role and cooperation with prosecutors. Sheila later entered a plea to first-degree murder. In a Monongalia County courtroom, a judge sentenced Rachel to 30 years with the possibility of parole after 10, and sentenced Sheila to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 15. Both were teenagers when they entered the system. Both remain incarcerated today at the Lakin Correctional Center in West Virginia. Public reaction blended sorrow and disbelief. Skylar's parents spoke of a daughter who was loyal to a fault, a child who considered these girls family. The Betrayal public appeals for help, coupled with private deception, became a national point of discussion about teen dynamics and the thin line between routine conflicts and something far more dangerous. In West Virginia, lawmakers advanced what became known as Skylar's Law to strengthen alerts for missing children who do not initially meet strict Amber criteria. A policy change driven by the difficult lessons of this case. Psychological assessments that might fully explain the motive remain limited in public records. What emerges from interviews and filings is an unsettling portrait of peer resentment hardening into premeditated exclusion, an extreme, irreversible answer to ordinary teenage friction. Investigators saw no grand ideology, no profit, no external coercion. Only a deliberate plan shaped by secrecy, rehearsal, and the confidence that adults would not suspect two smiling girls. Even years later, coverage of the case returns to the same question: how a friendship dissolved into calculated harm while the outward performance of normal life continued. As of mid-2025, Rachel Schoaf's parole window opened after 10 years, but there was no parole in that year, while Sheila Eddy remains ineligible until 2028. Both women are still serving their sentences in West Virginia. Number 2. Cassie Jo Stoddard was 16, a responsible high school junior from Pocatello, Idaho, known for good grades and a steady, kind presence among friends. That September, she was house-sitting for relatives, proud to be trusted with an adult task. Two classmates she knew well, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, both also 16, dropped by to watch a movie. To everyone who knew the trio, it looked like an ordinary weekend hangout. Nothing about Cassie's careful nature, nor the boys' everyday routines at school, hinted at what had been building beneath the surface. In the weeks leading up to that night, the boys were steeped in violent fantasy. They filmed themselves on a camcorder talking about plans and excitement, borrowing imagery and bravado from slasher movies, and treating harm as a path to notoriety. Investigators and later courts would describe a growing fixation, rehearsed talk, lists, and the rush of imagining themselves as famous. There were no clear signs of trauma forcing their hand. Rather, it looked like thrill, seeking shaped by media obsession and a need to impress each other, escalating from talk to intent. On the night Cassie was house-sitting, the boys left and then secretly returned. Wearing disguises and gloves, they moved through the home and interfered with the electricity to frighten and isolate her. What followed was fast and chaotic. Cassie, alone and unaware that her visitors had come back, faced a planned ambush. The method matched what they had discussed on their tapes. A close-range attack meant to shock, not a spontaneous outburst. The cruelty of the betrayal turning a friendly visit into a staged trap shook the small community that knew all three teenagers by name and face. The investigation closed in quickly. Detectives recovered the boys' recorded diaries, where they spoke on camera about their plot and their excitement, providing a timeline and a window into motive. Forensic work tied their movements to the house that night, and statements they gave shifted under scrutiny. In court records, the state summarized those videos as deliberate documentation of planning rather than after-the-fact bragging. Jurors later heard how the staged power outage and their return to the house were part of a premeditated script, inspired in part by a popular horror franchise. The tapes became the anchor of the case. Both teenagers were tried as adults in Idaho. Separate juries found each guilty of first-degree murder and of conspiracy to commit murder. Judges imposed fixed life terms for the murder counts and additional life terms on the conspiracy counts, with decades fixed before any possibility of parole under then-applicable law. In practice, those sentences amount to life imprisonment without parole. Appeals to the Idaho Supreme Court and later efforts to reduce the sentences did not change the outcome. Today, state records list Brian Draper in the Idaho State Correctional Institution, while reporting places Tori Adamczyk in an out-of-state facility under contract. Psychologically, the record points to performative cruelty rather than a grievance rooted in self-defense or desperation. The boys' own words captured before the crime suggest a search for identity, attention, and a narrative lifted from fiction, then acted out in real life. Reporters in court summaries have described it as a thrill motive, shaped by imitation and peer reinforcement. Whatever introspection has come since, including expressions of remorse in limited interviews, arrived long after the acts were planned and carried out. Factual close. Both Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk remain incarcerated on Idaho convictions for first-degree murder and conspiracy, serving life sentences that do not include the possibility of parole. Number 3. Elyse Bustamante was 15, a quiet sophomore from St. Martins, Missouri. Living with her grandparents and younger siblings after a childhood marked by parental instability, teachers saw a smart student who sometimes withdrew. Friends remembered bursts of dark humor and online posts that veered from ordinary teen talk into unsettling themes. In late October of 2009, her 9-year-old neighbor, Elizabeth Olten, a friend of Elyse's younger sister, walked a short distance from her home and did not return. The families knew each other. The path between their houses was familiar. What no one saw was the plan taking shape in Elyse's notebooks and in a shallow hole dug days earlier in the woods behind their street. In the months before the crime, Elyse struggled with depression and a prior suicide attempt, according to court testimony, and her online footprint suggested a fascination with harm and control. Investigators would later recover a personal journal entry from the night Elizabeth vanished, in which Elyse described a feeling of exhilaration and used the words, "pretty enjoyable." Prosecutors argued those phrases revealed motive as much as mindset. Not rage, not grievance, but curiosity, mixed with a thrill impulse that overrode empathy. On the evening of Wednesday, October 21st, Elyse lured Elizabeth from the neighborhood into a wooded area near their homes. Away from the streetlights and out of earshot, the attack unfolded quickly. The method matched what prosecutors later called deliberate preparation rather than a spontaneous act. Elyse had brought tools, and she had already chosen a place to hide what she planned to do. 2 days later, after searches and interviews, officers were led to the shallow grave, and recovered Elizabeth's body. The discovery collapsed a community's hope and shifted the investigation from a missing child case to a homicide centered on a teenager who lived only a few houses away. Interrogations exposed the planning and the absence of a direct personal dispute. Detectives collected the journal entry, statements from family members, and physical evidence from the wooded site. In early January of 2012, Elyse pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action, acknowledging a premeditated act without forcing Elizabeth's family through a trial. In early February of that year, a judge sentenced her to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole for the murder, plus a consecutive term of 30 years for the weapons count. Reporters in the courtroom noted Elyse's subdued demeanor as she answered the judge's questions and accepted the plea. Public reaction was grief first, then disbelief. Elizabeth's family spoke about a careful, cheerful child who loved school and trusted older kids on her street. Coverage turned national not only because the victim was so young, but because the assailant was a girl in her mid-teens who described the act in a diary with chilling detachment. Editorials and court filings wrestled with the balance between juvenile culpability and adult-level sentencing, even as appeals later failed to alter the outcome. Psychologically, the record points to depressive illness layered with a thrill-seeking motive. Mental health experts who evaluated Elyse described major depressive disorder and features of borderline personality structure. But the courtroom narrative emphasized choice and preparation over loss of control. The journal's language and the pre-dug grave framed the crime as intentional exploration of power and taboo, not a reaction to immediate provocation. That portrait sickness present, agency intact, guided both charging decisions and the final sentence. Factual close. Elyse Bustamante is serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole, plus a consecutive term of 30 years. She was denied parole in mid-2024. The next hearing is scheduled for 2029. She remains incarcerated in Missouri. Number 4. Michael Hernandez was 14. A quiet honor student at Southwood Middle School in Palmetto Bay, Florida, who spent weekends filming videos and browsing the darker corners of the internet. Classmates knew him as smart and reserved. Adults saw a polite boy from a stable suburban campus. His closest circle included Jaime Gough, also 14, a longtime friend from the same hallways and lunch tables. On a cool February morning in 2004, the two boys met before first period, as they often did, and Michael suggested he had something to show Jaime in the upstairs bathroom. It sounded harmless. It sounded like friendship. What followed, prosecutors later argued, did not erupt from sudden rage, but from planning. In a notebook and in conversations captured on his own camcorder, Michael cultivated a fantasy life built around notoriety. Detectives would eventually uncover a written kill list and evidence that he intended to harm two friends that very morning, beginning with Jaime and then luring another classmate. The picture that emerged was not one of impulsive teenage conflict, but of rehearsed steps and a script copied from the mythology of serial killers he idolized. Inside the tiled quiet of a school restroom, away from teachers and cameras, Michael carried out the plan. Afterward, he placed the weapon in a hidden compartment of his backpack, washed up, and walked to class as if the day were ordinary. A teacher noticed what looked like blood on his clothing, and the alarm spread quickly through the building. When staff searched the bathroom, they found what confirmed their worst fear, and police secured the hallways. In the hours that followed, Michael's story shifted, then collapsed under the weight of the physical evidence. The investigation moved from shock to method. Detectives collected the backpack and its contents, seized writings, and interviewed students about what they had seen that morning. The district attorney charged Michael as an adult. At trial, his lawyers presented an insanity defense, pointing to obsessive interests and disturbed thinking. Jurors rejected that claim and found him guilty of first-degree murder and of attempting to kill the second-listed target. The court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder and a consecutive term for the additional count, reflecting the premeditated nature of the attack and the risk to others. Years later, landmark rulings by the United States Supreme Court held that juveniles could not receive automatic life without parole sentences. Michael returned to court for a new hearing, where a judge again weighed his age against the deliberate planning, the list, and the lack of remorse shown in the aftermath. The court reimposed a life term, now discretionary and tailored to the record. And an appeals panel affirmed that decision, noting the careful consideration given to youth and rehabilitation while recognizing the severity of the crime. Public reaction in Miami-Dade balanced sorrow for Jaime's family with uneasy debates about punishment for offenders who were children at the time. Psychologically, the file suggests a blend of narcissistic fantasy and thrill-seeking layered onto adolescent isolation. Reporters and court summaries describe an identity quest built around dominance, lists, and practice runs. More performance than sudden break. Experts who later reviewed the case highlighted the imitation of serial killer lore and the reinforcement that came from scripting a narrative in writing and on video. That imitation, motive, attention, control. Infamy became the framework for understanding why a boy targeted his own friend on a routine school day. Factual close. Michael Hernandez remained in the custody of the Florida Department of Corrections until he died in custody in early May of 2021. An autopsy reported a fatal heart rhythm abnormality. No foul play was suspected. Number 5. Christine Marie Paulilla was 17, a Clear Lake High School student in suburban Houston who had recently gone from bullied outsider to a girl voted Miss Irresistible. Friends Rachel Colarudis and Tiffany Roll helped her fit in, inviting her into their circle and their homes. By the summer of 2003, Christine was dating 21-year-old Christopher Snyder. On the afternoon of July 18, 2003, the pair went to Tiffany's house in Clear Lake City, where Rachel was visiting along with Tiffany's boyfriend, Marcus Priscilla, and Marcus's cousin, Adalbert Sanchez, young adults who all knew each other. What unfolded there would later be known across Texas as the Clear Lake murders. Prosecutors and reporters later traced a web of pressures and choices around Christine. Adolescent insecurity, a strong need for approval, and a relationship that brought drugs and paranoia into daily life. In court filings and coverage, investigators described a plan framed as a robbery for drugs or money, not a sudden explosion. That distinction mattered. It suggested preparation and intent, not an argument that spiraled beyond control. The victims were not strangers. Two were her close friends from school, who had once defended her when others mocked her appearance and alopecia. Inside Tiffany's home that afternoon, the group hung out as they often did. Christine and Christopher had arrived armed one 9mm pistol and one .38 caliber revolver, according to later testimony and forensic work. Shots rang out in quick succession. Neighbors would recall the quiet, then sirens, and later the sight of detectives canvassing the street. When officers processed the scene, they recovered ballistic evidence from 2 weapons and began reconstructing who had come and gone. From the start, the pattern suggested a targeted event rather than random intrusion. For nearly 3 years, the case remained unsolved. Then, in mid-July of 2006, a tip to Crime Stoppers named Christine and Christopher. Houston police obtained a warrant and arrested Christine at a San Antonio hotel where she had been staying with a new husband amid heavy heroin use. In interviews, she first cast blame on Christopher. Later statements acknowledged her presence and handling a firearm. The case against the pair solidified further when authorities recovered the 2 handguns from a safe connected to Christopher's family out of state. Before officers could arrest him, Christopher fled and died by suicide later that summer. Tried alone in Harris County in October of 2008, Christine faced capital murder charges for the deaths of all 4 victims. Because she was a juvenile at the time of the offense, Texas law barred the death penalty. A jury found her guilty, and the court imposed life imprisonment. Under state law, a juvenile convicted of capital murder faces a life term with a minimum of 4 decades before parole consideration. Records list Christine's parole eligibility in the mid-2040s. In impact statements and interviews, families of the victims spoke of futures interrupted college plans, music, relationships, and expressed relief that the courtroom phase had ended. Why she participated has been debated for years. Coverage and appellate records point to a blend of motives. A desire to hold on to a volatile relationship, access to drugs and money, and lingering resentments that had little to do with any immediate threat. Experts referenced in filings and features described a teenager whose identity was fragile and easily steered, yet who still made a series of deliberate choices that day. The betrayal element, turning on the very friends who helped her belong, became the enduring frame through which the public understood the case. Factual close. Christine Paulilla remains incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice on a life sentence for capital murder, with parole eligibility after at least 4 decades served. Number 6. Sarah Ann Kolb was 16, a student at the Black Hawk College Outreach Center in the Quad Cities. Juggling teenage friendships, shifting identities, and a complicated bond with classmate Corey Gregory. New to the area, Adrien Reynolds was 16 as well. Ambitious, social, and fitting into a circle that overlapped with Sarah's. On a cold January afternoon in East Moline, the three agreed to meet for lunch at a fast food restaurant. To everyone around them, it looked like an ordinary hangout between friends. What followed, investigators later said, began as jealousy and control, and ended in a calculated act that would haunt the community for years. Tension inside the triangle had been building. Adrien had briefly dated Corey, and friends reported friction between the two girls. Prosecutors later described Sarah as angry and possessive, a teenager who feared losing status and influence in her close circle. In that emotional pressure cooker, impulsivity met planning. Witness accounts and court records would show that the meet-up for lunch was not simply a chance to talk, but the opening move in a plan to isolate Adrien and assert control in the most extreme way. In the parking lot outside the restaurant, a confrontation escalated. According to testimony, Sarah grabbed Adrien around the throat while Corey joined in with a belt. The suddenness of the assault and the way it unfolded in a public place before moving out of sight underlined how fast teenage conflict can turn when fueled by rage and the need to dominate. Afterward, the pair drove Adrien's body to a rural property tied to Sarah's family and tried to destroy evidence by fire. When that failed, they enlisted another teen acquaintance and concealed the remains off a wooded roadway. The betrayal friends turning on a friend shocked classmates who had seen the trio laughing together only days earlier. Detectives began with a missing person report when Adrien failed to show up for work, then quickly focused on the last people to see her. Within days, questioning turned into confession. Corey told police what happened and led them to the remains, providing investigators with the break that transformed rumor into a prosecutable case. Forensic evidence from the car, the farm, and the dump site supported the timeline. The narrative that emerged was not a mystery of unknown assailants, but a story of teenagers who turned on someone they knew well, then attempted a cover-up. Legal proceedings unfolded in separate tracks. Sarah's first trial ended with a hung jury and a mistrial. A retrial months later delivered convictions for first-degree murder and for concealment of a homicidal death. She received 48 years on the murder count and 5 additional years on the concealment count, to be served consecutively. Corey pleaded guilty to the same charges and received 40 years for murder and 5 for concealment. Newsrooms across Illinois covered the sentencings, the family's impact statements, and the reminders that juvenile defendants could still face long adult terms. Over the years that followed, appeals and resentencing requests were denied, with courts finding the original judges had considered youth while imposing lengthy terms. Psychologically, the record points to status anxiety, jealousy, and a need for control reinforced by the dynamics of a teenage triangle. There is no evidence of a psychotic break. Instead, court summaries describe a volatile relationship pattern where fear of losing influence hardened into premeditation. Experts and reporters have framed the motive as a mix of resentment and possessiveness, with peer reinforcement turning an argument into a plan. The case became a cautionary tale in local media about how swiftly adolescent conflict can escalate when weapons, secrecy, and the desire to win a relationship collide. Factual close. Sarah Kolb is incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center on a total sentence of 53 years. Corey Gregory is incarcerated at Pontiac Correctional Center on a total sentence of 45 years, following a later resentencing that reaffirmed those terms. Number 7. Jason Sweeney was 16, a construction helper from the Fishtown neighborhood of Philadelphia who spent afternoons lifting lumber and planning for summer. He trusted his circle, especially his childhood friend Edward Eddie Batzig Jr. And he had started seeing a 15-year-old classmate, Justina Morley. In late May of 2003, Dominic Koya and his younger brother Nicholas drifted into that same group. To neighbors, they were ordinary city kids who hung out near the river. To Jason, they were friends. On a Friday after payday, he agreed to meet them near a wooded footpath by the Delaware, a spot locals called the Trails. He did not expect betrayal. According to police and later testimony, the plan took shape over days. Justina would draw Jason away with flirtation, while the boys waited out of sight. The motive was painfully small. Cash Jason had just earned, roughly $500 from his construction job. Investigators later described a mix of greed, drug-seeking, and bravado, with letters and statements pointing to a plot rather than a spontaneous outburst. There was no feud to resolve, no long-running grudge. It was the kind of plan teenagers convince each other to carry out because no adult is watching, and the imagined payoff feels huge. At the Trails, the meeting turned into an ambush. Jason's calls for help were overwhelmed by the attack, and the group fled with the cash. That night, according to reporting at the time, they bought drugs and bragged to acquaintances. In the following hours, parents called around, friends compared stories, and detectives began piecing together who had last seen Jason and where. The picture hardened quickly: a lure, a secluded place, and a circle of friends who were now suspects. The shock in Fishtown came as much from the setting as from the brutality. The idea that a teenager could be harmed in a place he knew by people he trusted. The investigation moved with urgency. Detectives interviewed classmates and traced movements along the river trail. Within days, Edward Batzig Jr. gave a statement that led police to crucial evidence and to the others. The district attorney charged Dominic Koya, Nicholas Koya, and Batzig with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and robbery. Justina Morley, who cooperated, faced separate proceedings. Prosecutors detailed the lure and ambush sequence and the theft of Jason's paycheck. The case became a local and national story about peer betrayal, with courtroom coverage focusing on letters the teens wrote from jail and on their shifting accounts of the planning. In 2005, separate juries convicted Dominic, Nicholas, and Batzig of first-degree murder and related crimes. Under Pennsylvania law at the time, those convictions carried mandatory life imprisonment without parole for juveniles. The judge also imposed additional decades for the accompanying felonies. Years later, after United States Supreme Court rulings limited automatic life without parole sentences for juveniles, Pennsylvania courts reviewed many cases, including this one. In 2015, a Philadelphia judge considered youth-related factors and again imposed a life term on Nicholas Koya. Similar outcomes followed for the others. Meanwhile, Justina Morley pleaded guilty to third-degree murder and received a term of 17.5 to 35 years. She was released on parole in late 2020. Psychologically, filings and coverage emphasize opportunistic motive. A quick score fueled by drug use, peer pressure, and a desire to impress. Accounts describe no diagnosed psychosis driving the plot. Instead, they point to group dynamics, flirtation as bait, promises of easy money, and the false confidence of teenagers acting together. Experts quoted in features and in court records framed the crime as a convergence of immaturity and calculated planning, with each participant reinforcing the other's worst impulses. Factual close. Dominic Koya, Nicholas Koya, and Edward Batzig Jr. remain incarcerated on life sentences for first-degree murder, along with additional terms for robbery and conspiracy. Justina Morley is on parole after serving more than 17 years of a third-degree murder sentence. Number 8. Amber Wright was 15. A high school sophomore from Summerfield, Florida. Known among friends for quick texts and quicker emotions, her world overlapped with that of Seath Jackson, a 15-year-old ex-boyfriend she had dated on and off, and with her older circle that included Michael Bargo, Justin Soto, her brother Kyle Hooper, and a classmate named Charlie Ely. To classmates, the drama looked like ordinary teenage turbulence accusations. Jealousy, shifting loyalties. Beneath it, prosecutors later said, a plan formed that would turn adolescent conflict into a coordinated trap. In the days before the crime, messages flew back and forth. Witnesses and later filings described taunts, threats, and talk of payback, with Bargo at the center and others reinforcing the idea that Seath had to be taught a lesson. Friends testified that Amber's texts shifted tone sweet one minute, inviting reconciliation, then cold the next, creating a believable path to lure Seath to a meeting. Investigators would argue that group dynamics fed the escalation. A search for status, a volatile romance, and the false confidence of acting as a pack. On a Sunday in mid-April of 2011, Seath arrived at a small house in Summerfield that the group often used to hang out. He thought he was stepping toward a conversation with Amber. What he entered instead was a staged ambush inside a cramped room, with Bargo and others waiting. Neighbors later recalled sirens and searchlights by night, and by morning detectives were scouring a backyard fire pit and a vehicle for traces. The emerging story of a teenager lured by affection and confronted by a group shocked even seasoned deputies in Marion County. The investigation moved fast. Detectives obtained phones, pulled message histories, and followed leads to a rural quarry outside Ocala. Statements from multiple defendants converged on the same timeline. A lure to the house, violence inside, an attempt to destroy evidence, and efforts to hide what remained. Within weeks, arrests followed. Justin Soto entered a plea to first-degree murder and accepted a life term. His decision gave prosecutors additional corroboration against the others. Trials for Amber Wright and Kyle Hooper showcased the text exchanges and witness testimony, and juries in Marion County returned guilty verdicts for first-degree murder. Michael Bargo, identified as the adult ringleader and the shooter, faced a separate capital trial. After a resentencing required by changes in Florida law, a new jury unanimously recommended death, and in late June of 2021, the Florida Supreme Court affirmed that sentence. He remains on death row. Because Amber and Kyle were juveniles at the time, their life sentences are subject to review after at least 25 years under revised juvenile sentencing rules. Nonetheless, the court reimposed life imprisonment in Amber's case after a second hearing, and she remains incarcerated. Kyle likewise remains in state custody on a life term. Charlie Ely, who provided the house and was originally sentenced to life, later won relief. In mid-2020, she accepted a new conviction for second-degree murder, received a 10-year sentence, and was released for time served. Public response mixed grief and disbelief. Seath's family spoke in court about a teenager who trusted easily and loved loudly, while local coverage described the case as a painful lesson in how quickly online taunts and teen rivalries can harden into real-world violence when a dominant personality pushes a plan and peers fall in line. Reporters and appellate records framed the motive as a blend of jealousy, group loyalty, and thrill-seeking bravado, amplified by constant texting that made rash choices feel urgent and inevitable. Factual close. Michael Bargo remains on Florida's death row. Amber Wright and Kyle Hooper are serving life sentences with review eligibility after at least 25 years. Justin Soto is serving life without parole. Charlie Ely was released in mid-2020 after a resentencing agreement. Number 9. Alec Kreider was 16. A Manheim Township high school student from suburban Lancaster, who spent weekends biking with friends and eating at local diners. Among those friends was Kevin Haynes, also 16, a classmate whose family often welcomed Alec into their home. To neighbors and teachers, Alec seemed quiet, distant at times, but not alarming. The Haynes family, Thomas, Lisa, and their children were known as steady and warm. In early May of 2007, that shared world of homework, curfews, and weekend plans shattered in the quiet hours after midnight. Investigators and later court records would describe a boy wrestling with depression and dark ideation in the months before the crime. His father would eventually write about missed signs and a son who grew increasingly withdrawn. a teenager whose writing sometimes veered into hostility toward happiness itself. The portrait is not of a sudden break, but of a deepening isolation that family and friends struggled to interpret. Even after the murders, when the community gathered for memorials, Alec maintained a composed exterior that left classmates stunned once the truth emerged. In the earliest hours of Saturday, May 12th, Alec entered the Haynes home in the Blossom Hill neighborhood of Manheim Township. What happened next unfolded swiftly in the upstairs hallway and bedrooms while most of the family slept. Kevin's older sister awoke to sounds of struggle, fled the house, and reached a neighbor who called 911. By dawn, police had secured the scene and notified extended family. The lack of forced entry and the absence of an apparent motive confounded investigators and terrified a community that had long considered the neighborhood safe. For more than a month, detectives chased tips, re-interviewed students, and reconstructed movements through the neighborhood. The breakthrough came when Alec's father, worried by his son's writings and behavior, contacted authorities and reported a confession. From there, the case moved quickly. Alec was arrested in mid-June, charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, and held for trial. The revelation that the assailant was the best friend of one victim deepened public grief, turning the case into a national story of trust violated from the inside. In June of 2008, Alec pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, sparing the Haynes family a contested trial. A Lancaster County judge imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Under the law at that time, those were mandatory penalties. In court, the surviving sister delivered a recorded statement about loss that could not be measured. And when the judge asked Alec to explain why, he answered that there was no explanation. Appeals and later collateral challenges did not alter the convictions or the structure of the sentence. Years later, after United States Supreme Court rulings limited automatic life without parole sentences for juveniles, Alec's case was among those flagged for review. While legal teams prepared for resentencing hearings, he remained in state custody. In late January of 2017, the Cumberland County coroner reported that Alec died by suicide at the State Correctional Institution at Camp Hill. Prison staff and emergency responders attempted life-saving measures, but he was pronounced dead that afternoon. He was 25 years old. Psychologically, the public record suggests a combination of depressive illness and violent ideation rather than a concrete grievance against the Haynes family. Reporting and family accounts reference private writings about a desire to harm and an animosity toward happy people, contrasted against outward calm that hid planning from peers. Investigators never identified a single trigger that adequately explained why a teenager targeted his closest friend and the people who treated him like family. That absence, no feud, no profit, no coerced involvement, remains the most confounding element of the case. Factual close. Alec Kreider pleaded guilty in June of 2008 and received 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. He died in state prison in January of 2017. Number 10. Aaron Romeo Trejo was 16, a Mishawaka high school football player from northern Indiana who moved through the same hallways as cheerleader Briana Rouselang. They were classmates who kept their relationship quiet, a teenage secret layered over homework, practices, and weekend games. Brianna was 17, and by late autumn of 2018, 6 months pregnant. Friends described her as upbeat and involved. Adults saw 2 kids still figuring out what to do next. On a cold weekend in December, that private world unraveled in a way that stunned their community. In the weeks before the killing, investigators later learned Aaron fixated on the pregnancy and the belief that choices were narrowing. When questioned after his arrest, he told detectives he was angry that Brianna had waited so long to tell him beyond the window when he thought an abortion could happen, and he admitted he had been considering killing her for about a week. Those statements, recorded in charging documents, shaped the state's view of motive. Anger at lost control, fear of exposure, and a decision to end a problem rather than face it. Late on Saturday, December 8th into the early hours of Sunday, December 9th, Aaron arranged to meet Brianna not far from a local restaurant. What happened next, reconstructed from surveillance, phone records, and his confession, was swift. Brianna's body was later found in a dumpster. Her phone and the weapon were discarded separately, an attempt to slow detection that did not hold. By morning, officers from the street, Joseph County Metro Homicide Unit had secured the area and begun interviewing friends and family. The discovery shifted the case from a missing person alert to a homicide investigation that drew national coverage. Arrested the same day, Aaron waived many of the usual defenses teens sometimes raise and gave a detailed account that matched key pieces of evidence. Prosecutors charged him as an adult with murder and with feticide, a separate offense under Indiana law recognizing the death of the unborn child. The charging documents emphasized his admissions, the planning window of roughly a week, and the disposal steps after the attack. Court hearings in the days that followed drew reporters and a packed gallery, while Brianna's family spoke softly about a daughter who loved school and cheer, and about an empty chair that could not be filled. In late October of 2019, Aaron pleaded guilty to both murder and feticide. That plea removed any doubt about the core facts and spared the family a contested trial. In early January of the following year, a Joseph County judge imposed a combined sentence of 65 years, 55 years for murder, and 10 years for feticide, to run one after the other, with no time suspended. News accounts noted the judge's emphasis on planning, on the vulnerability of a pregnant teen, and on the profound harm left behind. Aaron entered the Indiana Department of Correction with a release horizon measured not in semesters but in decades. Psychologically, the record does not point to psychosis or a sudden break. Instead, investigators and prosecutors described a calculated, resentful response to responsibility, amplified by secrecy and panic about consequences. His own statements, anger at timing, a week of contemplation, and a matter-of-fact confession paint a portrait of control sought through elimination rather than reckoning. Coverage in national and local outlets framed the case as a brutal example of relationship violence among teenagers and of how quickly denial can turn into irreversible decisions. Factual close. Aaron Trejo pleaded guilty to murder and feticide and is serving a sentence of 65 years in the Indiana State Prison System, with 55 years for murder and 10 years for feticide ordered to be served consecutively. Number 11. Luke Mitchell was 14, a schoolboy from Dalkeith, Midlothian, who spent afternoons with a tight circle of friends and his girlfriend, Jodi Jones. On a summer evening in late June of 2003, Jodi left home to meet him for a walk along a familiar shortcut. She did not return. Hours later, Mitchell joined relatives and neighbors to search the path. With the group, he went through a gap in a wall and helped locate Jodi along the wooded route that locals used every day. What looked at first like a worried boyfriend helping a family would soon draw intense police scrutiny. In the months that followed, detectives and reporters pieced together a portrait of a teenager who had drifted into darker interests. Court coverage noted cannabis use and an obsession with transgressive imagery, including art and media linked to shock, rock, and bleak themes. Prosecutors would later argue that this fascination mattered not as a crime itself, but as context for a young person already pushing boundaries, testing personas, and writing about disturbing ideas. That framing conduct plus mindset became part of the case the public heard as the investigation unfolded. The core timeline remained stubborn and simple. Jodi left to meet her boyfriend. She was found dead on the path they often used. There were no eyewitnesses to the killing, no recording, no single piece of forensic proof that told the entire story. The case hinged on inconsistencies in Mitchell's account, his proximity to the discovery, and what the Crown described as guilty knowledge of where to look in the darkness. Jurors heard how he moved directly to the wall gap and into the trees where Jodi lay. Behavior the prosecution cast as too precise to be coincidence. By January of 2005, after a lengthy high court trial in Edinburgh, a jury found Luke Mitchell guilty of murdering Jodi Jones. The judge described the crime as truly evil, and in February of that year imposed life imprisonment with a minimum punishment period of 20 years before any parole consideration. Those sentencing remarks, reported widely at the time, emphasized both the brutality of the attack and the trust Jodi had placed in meeting someone she cared for that evening. Public reaction was immediate and polarized. Many felt the verdict delivered accountability in a case that terrorized a small town. Others questioned whether a largely circumstantial prosecution should carry a lifetime consequence for a teenager. Over the years, documentaries and advocacy groups revisited aspects of the record, while Scotland's criminal case review body declined to refer the case for a new appeal. Through it all, Jodi's family maintained a steady presence, marking anniversaries and speaking about a daughter and sister lost at 14. Psychologically, what emerges from reporting and court summaries is not a clinical diagnosis placed at the center of events, but a convergence of adolescent identity testing, drug use, and a fixation on violent imagery that prosecutors said bled into real life. Defense arguments pushed back, emphasizing the absence of a clear, singular proof and warning against reading taste as intent. The jury, weighing those competing narratives against the timeline and Mitchell's conduct, reached its verdict. As an adult prisoner, Mitchell has continued to maintain his innocence. He became eligible to be considered for release in the spring of 2024, counting time served on remand. After the parole board for Scotland refused release, he sought a judicial review. In February of 2025, the Court of Session issued an opinion rejecting his challenge and confirming that the board had acted lawfully. He remains incarcerated. Factual close. Luke Mitchell is serving a life sentence in Scotland for the murder of Jodi Jones, with a minimum term set at 20 years. His parole was refused, and a 2025 judicial review challenging that refusal was unsuccessful. Number 12. Joshua Davies was 16, a schoolboy from a small community near Bridgend in South Wales, known to teachers as bright and to friends as moody and attention-seeking. His on and off girlfriend, Rebecca Aylward, was 15, thoughtful and excited about a possible reconciliation. On a wet Saturday in late October of 2010, Rebecca put on a new outfit and left home to meet Joshua near the woods by Aberconfig. She never came back. That night, Joshua appeared to help search and even sent messages that looked like concern, a performance that initially kept suspicion at bay. In the weeks before, Joshua had been talking too casually and too often about harming Rebecca. Classmates later told investigators he joked about poison made from plants and boasted that if he ever went through with it, someone owed him breakfast. Most peers rolled their eyes, but the talk revealed a teenager rehearsing control and admiration. The breakfast dare became a trivial, chilling marker of ego, not a real motive in itself. The Crown later framed these comments as context for a young person pushing boundaries and testing who would listen. On Saturday, October 23rd, Joshua arranged a walk under the pretense of getting back together. He led Rebecca along a wooded path and, out of sight of nearby homes, carried out an attack that ended her life. He left her face down among wet leaves and rain, then tried to script the narrative. He texted her phone to ask where she was, and told others he worried she had not shown up. The next day, whispers in the village turned to fear, and police activity thickened around the woods. The contrast between the tenderness of a hoped-for reunion and the cold steps that followed defined public horror at what had happened. Detectives built their case without a single smoking gun forensic item. Instead, the timeline and behavior spoke loudly. Witnesses described Joshua's earlier boasts. Digital records captured his messages before and after, and friends recounted how he tried to shift blame onto someone else. Prosecutors emphasized what they called guilty knowledge. When the search party reached the stone wall gap leading to the spot where Rebecca lay, Joshua moved decisively toward it, as if he already knew. In late July of 2011, after a weeks-long trial at Swansea Crown Court, a jury returned a majority guilty verdict for murder. Sentencing came a few weeks later. Because he was under 18, Joshua could not receive a whole life tariff, but the judge ordered life detention with a minimum punishment period of 14 years before any chance of parole. Reporting from the courtroom noted the judge's stark language about a senseless, cruel act and the trust Rebecca placed in meeting someone she loved that afternoon. Outside court, Rebecca's family spoke with quiet fury about plans never to be realized and about a sentence that, though substantial, could never measure what was taken. Psychologically, the public record shows no diagnosis at the center of events. Rather, It shows a teenager cultivating an image, dabbling in violent talk, flirting with transgressive art and bravado, and seeking status among peers. Prosecutors argued that this performance hardened into action when an opportunity presented itself. The defense pushed back, stressing the circumstantial nature of the case and warning against equating taste with intent. The jury weighed those narratives against the messages, the timeline, and Joshua's conduct before and after, and reached its decision. Factual close. Joshua Davies is serving a life sentence for the murder of Rebecca Aylward, with a minimum term of 14 years before parole eligibility, imposed by Swansea Crown Court in the late summer of 2011. He remains incarcerated in the United Kingdom. Number 13. Scarlett Jenkinson was 15, and Eddie Ratcliffe was the same age. Classmates from the Warrington area who drifted between group chats, school corridors, and the quiet green strips that cut through Culcheth. Briana Ghey was 16. Funny online and shy in person. A teenager who loved fashion and filmed short clips for friends. On a damp Saturday in mid-February of 2023, Brianna left home to meet people she considered friends at Culcheth Linear Park. She did not return. Hours later, police cordoned off a winding path beneath bare winter branches, and a family waited for answers that would change their lives. In the weeks before that day, messages and searches sketched a disturbing picture. The pair swapped ideas about harming someone, traded references to pain and power, and spoke about picking a target. Prosecutors later said Scarlett's interest in extreme violence was not a crime by itself, but it was the context for choices that followed. Eddie's messages, some of which used dehumanizing language about Brianna's identity, added a thread of prejudice to a plan already shaped by cruelty. Together, those threads told a story of teenagers rehearsing control and notoriety, then deciding to act. On the afternoon of Saturday, February 11th, they arranged to meet Brianna in the park. The encounter moved quickly and out of view, along a stretch of path screened by trees. Afterwards, the pair left as if nothing had happened. When detectives began to assemble a timeline, digital traces spoke first. Calls and texts, step counts, app data, and the absence of messages that should have been there. Statements from friends filled in details about earlier boasts and grim fantasies. What emerged was not a misunderstanding or self-defense, but a planned attack on someone who trusted them enough to show up and walk beside them. Arrests followed within a day. As officers worked through phones and interviews, the Crown built a case around premeditation, joint participation, and what the judge later described as an exceptionally brutal act. In December of 2023, a Manchester Crown Court jury returned guilty verdicts for murder. At sentencing in early February of 2024, the judge lifted reporting restrictions, naming Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, and imposing life detention at His Majesty's pleasure. The minimum terms reflected their roles: 22 years for Scarlett, identified as the driving force, and 20 years for Eddie. The court stressed the planning, the choice of a secluded location, and the chilling calm that followed. Public reaction mixed shock with calls for better protection of vulnerable youth. Brianna's family described a daughter who was gentle and eager to be accepted, and they thanked the community that had stood watch through long hearings. When the Attorney General reviewed the sentences under the unduly lenient scheme, authorities declined to challenge them. And later, when Eddie sought permission to appeal for a shorter term based on immaturity, the Court of Appeal refused, concluding the minimum set by the trial judge was justified. Psychologically, the courtroom record highlights sadistic curiosity, peer reinforcement, and a fascination with exerting power. Expert evidence and the teenager's own messages suggested that Scarlett's fixation on harm and Eddie's eagerness to please converged into a decision to test boundaries in the worst possible way. Prosecutors argued any transphobic sentiment amplified an already dehumanizing outlook, while the defense warned against treating dark interests as destiny. The jury weighed words, movements, and planning against those cautions and returned its verdict. Factual close. Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe are serving life sentences for the murder of Briana Ghey. with minimum terms of 22 years and 20 years respectively. Eddie's later attempt to reduce his term was rejected by the Court of Appeal.